welcome back. It's still Now Breakfast here on Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos. My name's Nabila Usman. Today's Tuesday, the 2nd of January 2024, and it's time for Tech Now. On Tech Now this morning, opensource.com describes open source as, quote, something people can modify and share because its design is publicly accessible. The very design of open source is what has made it a point of contention in legal battles across the world, but particularly in the US, where some of the latest developments are that media companies and other individuals are suing tech companies like OpenAI for using their data to train the artificial intelligence ChatGPT. Large language models such as ChatGPT, learn by analyzing a massive amount of data often sourced online. The conclusion of these legal battles will be critical in shaping the future of artificial intelligence and open source. Joining us on this discussion is Justin Irabor. Mr. Irabor is an AI product engineer at the International University of Applied Sciences, Berlin, Germany. Hello and welcome to the conversation, Mr. Irabor.
Hello, good morning, Nabila. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I want to start off with questions around whether the definition of open source has evolved since the very first time it came out, considering all the new dynamics, the new ways you can sort of modify whether it is initial code or just data that is out in the public space.
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. The definition of open source hasn't changed much across the years. It still implies that this is content, and usually it refers to code that has been, created by the common, by the public, and it's intended for use by anyone, and it's intended for manipulation. So the idea is that if you create output that is open source, somebody else can take it and then modify it and then spin out or fork a new version of that project. It allows collaboration, and it also allows like new ideas to be experimented with. Open source is technically a reaction to the closed source and commercialized products and projects out there, allowing it's a defense against capture of certain kind of public goods, and that's the core idea. Yeah.
And how important would you say it is to the current tech landscape?
Open source remains very important. It's important even for political reasons, where you have various kinds of products and various types of data that get siloed in centralized databases that make tech giants a bit too powerful and a bit too opaque to interact with or to regulate. And open source are usually defensive plays where you create an open source version of a popular product so that people have the alternative. If you don't want to give your data to a centralized agency, or if you want a more open, a more transparent community to be, you want to affiliate with a more open and transparent community, then you opt in for open source products, or you even go and contribute, if you're an engineer, to the promotion and to the development of open source products. Yeah.
And I mean, you talk about it being a reaction to the closed end of, closed source in this case, you may as well just call it that. And yet over the years, I think to a large degree, we've seen a few more companies in different aspects, in different industries, if you like, kind of throw up, if you like, a paywall. They've thrown up a guard around their data. And part of it is supposed to be a reaction. It's like a counter reaction, if you like, to these big tech companies that are even bigger and seem more powerful than some of the most powerful governments in the world. I wonder how that has shaped the conversation so far and what the impact has been.
Yeah. So I guess there are many trends there are many things to observe when it comes to, companies paywalling their content, and some of them are reactions to big companies scraping everybody's data to train large language models or AI products. That obviously, is a reaction to that. The way that the web was designed is just a series of documents that you can If you know the IP addresses of those documents, you can retrieve them, you can modify them if you have access. The web is dynamic, and all the content was designed to be accessible for anyone who has permissions to. And that means that crawlers like Google can crawl websites and then store that data in their databases, and then they can do whatever they want with that data. And that's the basis on which large language models, AI, ChatGPT, and all, that's the basis on which they get trained. And which means that if you have your content on the internet, it will eventually go into a large language model with or without your explicit permission. And so a lot of prestigious and old legacy content providers do not quite like that idea. And so they started to put their content behind paywalls, but it's a little bit like locking the stable after the horses have bolted, because all the content that has ever existed in the history of the webs of the internet pretty much already absorbed by large language models. So yeah.
And this brings us to the legal conversation. So very recently, and I'll use the media as an example, right? This was last week when the big media company in the US, the New York Times, officially filed a suit against OpenAI, claiming that there was copyright infringement in how it trained its system using their data. And they talk about ChatGPT sometimes generating verbatim excerpts from New York Times articles. In some ways, they might be late to the game in terms of the legal battle, because I know a few months ago, there were some authors, writers of fiction, who also bandied together to file a lawsuit because of this same issue. Let's speak about those dynamics and some of the arguments that are being had in tech spaces around open source versus copyright.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So even though the New York Times is late to the suing game, I think they have the strongest argument here. So one of the principles of those AI models is that they do take your content, but they do not spit it out verbatim. So basically, they're teaching the models with the content to go on to create original content. And now we found that this OpenAI has basically prompted its own artificial intelligence models to give higher priority to contents gotten from the New York Times, which means that it does spit out the content, without modifications, exactly as so it's basically committing plagiarism. The implication here, obviously, is that you are stealing the intellectual property of the New York Times, which means that attribution is scrubbed, and the New York Times makes nothing from content it has spent years investing in and creating. And now that you can prove that this content is directly sourced from the New York Times, that becomes a problem for OpenAI. And the second problem, obviously, is that even while citing the New York Times, the OpenAI models hallucinate, which means that they forge some of the crucial details contained in the New York Times reports. And so it basically like puts the New York Times in a bad light, because it misattributes and miscategorizes its original information. So it's the worst of both worlds, right? Zero attribution and misinformation coming from the OpenAI LLMs. So they do have a legal case, and in the past, there have been some philosophical and legal arguments about how can you really attribute something that has gone through a model and has been rewritten and fine-tuned, and you lose attribution along the way, something called bit rinsing, right? And you can't really say that the original author can really lay claim to this information, even though the knowledge really comes from the author. You can no longer prove ownership. But in the New York Times, in the case of the New York Times, you can prove ownership, which means that this will be like a real problem for OpenAI. I personally am excited to see what new laws form out of this, because this is really uncharted territory. And like I said, the New York Times has the strongest argument so far in the list of people who have in the past. And so, yeah, it's one to watch.
I mean, besides these companies, the big governments, strong governments in the world, I mean, I think very quickly about the European Union and the Commission and some of the laws that they typically set up to protect their people. I think about the US government and how it is also trying to navigate this new uncharted territory, which you mentioned. The UK also had the same thing when they did I think it was the AI summit where the prime minister sat with Elon Musk in conversation. So there are questions on how, even if the legal battles don't, whatever ends up being the final verdict, there's still questions on how these governments will respond. So with this landscape unfolding, what have you seen that is different about how these tech companies, how OpenAI and other companies such as itself are responding to these upcoming challenges or the current challenges?
So one way that I think that the big AI companies will react or are reacting so far is to admit fault and to pay for the crime. Look, it's pretty damning what has happened with OpenAI, and I don't think that they are going to put up so much of a fight. I think they're just going to try and settle, especially with platforms like the New York Times. I think in the future, when it comes to training, they will probably do less weighting, which means that when you get the data from a specific publisher, you attribute more value to it, which causes the LLM to just spit it out verbatim when asked a question that matches the data stored. So a lot of obfuscation will happen, unfortunately. A way to bury the lid, to hide the fact that this was trained on a specific entity's data collection. I do not think that any of this is going to slow down the march of data scraping because of the way the internet has historically been set up. It's a long architectural process, and there's not a lot that's going to change from the way that we currently have these things. What is going to happen is that there will be a lot more thoughtfulness about how data is reflected through LLMs. The real problem here is that LLMs are really large, and it's kind of hard for any one person to reason about how they, process data and they, generate content. So there will be a bit of more intelligent analysis and data reflection, but I do not think that they're going to stop scraping. I think they might enter into partnerships, exclusive partnership with certain publishers, which I think is also what publishers want. And for the little guys, not a lot is going to change. So if you have a personal blog, it will still get absorbed in the LLMs, unless you are explicitly protected by your government, and that is like several years down the road. I don't think that regulation ever catches up fast to innovation, and that's always been the reality of the open web.
I want you to talk about, the last time we had you on Radio Now, this was on the heels of ChatGPT being a fresh thing. A lot was unknown, even though a lot still remains unknown about it, but at least we're in a more solid place in understanding ChatGPT and the revolution of artificial intelligence. And I'm curious as to what you have seen, and it's matured to some degree, and how you're thinking about the growth of AI over the past year. And in the context of what you've just said, just to sort of situate the African continent and countries such as ours, Nigeria, how they will be affected by these developments.
So the thing about AI models is that they are powered by something called an attention mechanism, which is just you feed these models a lot of data and they get really smart, right? And that's what OpenAI has been doing. In the last year, I say in the last 6 months, they have been working on a multimodal solution, which means that it's not just a model that interacts with text, as we know. It interacts with audio, interacts with video, and so the model can watch a video, can look at an image, can hear an audio, and then synthesize content and respond, which makes it a way more powerful solution than it was, say, a year ago. And if we think about the African continent, like in relation to innovation globally, the fact remains that we are playing in a very resource greedy space. That's the LLM space. You need a lot of computers, a lot of compute, a lot of researchers, and you need a lot of data. And we cannot stress how much data we need. We are currently on the back foot, even though there's some innovation in the African space and in the natural language processing space. But globally, we will, be beholden to guys in the Americas or in any place that's very rich in compute, right? It's a really expensive endeavor, and the only way that it justifies the investment is to become, partnered with a really massive big tech company or maybe a big government agency. In the case of OpenAI, for example, they are partnered with Microsoft, as you know, and so we have to think about the economics of it all for Africa to be an innovator in the space. Right now, we are somewhere down the line. So Africans are building AI products, but not AI models because building AI models is a really expensive process. The good news is it's getting cheaper by the minute. Right now, you can take an off-the-shelf model and then retrain it, and then you can, spit out a new model, which is how guys like Mixtral and Facebook Llama 2B models, for example, came into the marketplace. So there is hope that we probably can, bypass the whole, use a lot of computers like OpenAI, and then use a lot of data and take all that work and then, fork it again in the open source philosophy. Take something that used to be commercialized, create an open source version, and then you have a competing chance. And that's where I see Africans, participating. And I've seen some chatter in the public space from Africans that are working in the space. So yeah.
I wonder to what extent this can be done without government support. And I ask this hoping you will draw from your experience. As I understand it, you yourself built your own chatbot, Kainene Voice Savant. And there are questions on the lessons you've learned being a private entity and being able to set this up, and where government could come in, whether they could have come in or not. And just thinking about the large scale of work that you have outlined in your previous response in how we need to meet up and match up with societies that are better technologically connected than we are.
Yeah. So historically, the AI project, artificial intelligence, has been something that has been heavily backed by the American Defense Department. I mean, even in wartime. And so the reason why AI has advanced in the US as fast as it has is because of government support. In Nigeria, or in Africa, I would say, we don't have anything mirroring that. And so, we've not accelerated as much on AI. But right now, we have an opportunity to do some really interesting things. One is that when it comes to natural language understanding, I think Nigerians are better poised or Africans are better poised to index and catalog their languages and get these AI models to be really good at African languages. Those models still struggle with, Yoruba, Hausa, Swahili and all that. And so if we do have vested interest in making it possible for AI models to interact in the natural tongue of Africans, we have the opportunity to make them conversant with African customs, and that will increase our cultural foothold even within the LLM space. And that will also, I guess, inspire some product development. One of the primary use cases for LLMs today is education, and it's still, westernized languages that are represented in the education space. And the work that I do right now is to try and make sure that, you can teach using artificial intelligence models to anybody in any language, in any setting they prefer. And that's a niche advantage that Africans can provide.
And just as we wrap up, I mean, the language in itself is one thing, but there's also just the content. Much of the content around Africa, Nigeria, all our customs and cultures, much of what is accessible online is still minute compared to the vast universe of information that's out there. And even in that minuteness, there's quite a bit of it that wasn't exactly initiated by Africans. And where some Africans even initiated, you still have a westernized, if you like, a westernized perspective of what is out there. So with ChatGPT, for instance, if you're going to if it's going to give you information on Africa, it would still be biased towards what is that Western perspective. How do we combat the data, the information out there in terms of just the numbers?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's what I was alluding to. Because we don't have that much of a digital footprint, and we don't have that much data to scrape. We're going to have to do this like we're going to have to brute force it with a bunch of researchers and a bunch of content creators specifically for training the AI models. In the past, when Google was trying to bring Google Maps into Africa, one of the challenges was that, the maps couldn't speak Pidgin, they couldn't speak, natural Nigerian languages. And so Google hired a bunch of researchers and a bunch of content creators to create content that then they used to train their NLP models that then, became the voiceovers that you hear when you use Google Maps in Nigerian languages. And I think something like that on a much larger scale, again, is going to be super expensive, but well worth it, because that's the only way we can, leapfrog and then have Africans represented in the LLM content space. We do have to invest in content. We have to think about either, transcribing a whole bunch of content into specific languages, or get a whole bunch of people to create codex of languages. And there are a bunch of language researchers in Nigeria that I know of right now that are doing this work. It's slow moving because of funding, but if it were supercharged and accelerated with government support, then this could move a lot faster. The problem here is that the kind of people who seem to be interested in African languages end up being the big tech instead of the local or the federal governments of those countries. So it ends up being skewed towards developing a westernized product. And so it ends up being that the tools that are better at, parsing or scanning Nigerian languages or African languages end up being westernized tools, not even, homegrown products. And so we do need to take it seriously, and also we do need to invest, resources in it. There is no magical solution here.
Well, Mr. Irabor, a big thank you to you. It's been a fruitful and very informative conversation with you this morning.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to be here.
Our guest on Tech Now, Justin Irabor, is an AI product engineer at the International University of Applied Sciences, Berlin, Germany, speaking to us on open source, but not just open source, really, the legal battles between that and copyright infringement claims by companies in some parts of the world. And that's Tech Now today. You can catch a fresh edition next week, Tuesday, same time, same station, here on Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos. I'm Nabila Usman. Now breakfast continues shortly.